Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third webinar in our autumn webinar series. I'm Emily Townsend, I'm President of LCANZ, and I will be your host for today. As those of you who've been signing in up to now will know, we've got quite an exciting program coming up over the next few months. We've now confirmed all of our dates and speakers, and registrations are open for all of the future ones. So details are on the website. Do check it out. Keep an eye on social media for more details about who's speaking and what they're talking about. Also, a reminder that we're running a competition during the series with the opportunity to win a year's membership. So keep dialing in, keep listening, take notes. There will be a short quiz at the end. Not at the end of this webinar, at the end of the series. So on to today. I am delighted to welcome Barbara as our speaker. As our previous president, Barbara won't really need any introduction to long-term LCANZ members. So I'm going to hand straight over to Barbara to tell us all about science-based targets and how they link into LCA.
For a change, we'll not be talking about LCA only. So thanks for having me. And I'll be talking about science-based targets and net zero. What does it actually mean? The cover photo doesn't actually have anything to do with carbon. It's just a happy photo. And I think sometimes you just need happy photos. I made the assumption that the water is all saved rainwater. That's about us. Most of you probably know us, so we are a few more than those few people here. We are now a team of over 40 and have been doing what we do for over 15 years for quite a few clients. That does include LCA, but also carbon. And today really is about science-based targets. It's about setting proper targets when it comes to carbon reduction, because just saying we'll reduce just is no longer good enough. So the Science-Based Target Initiative came together from 4 organizations, from CDP, previously known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, the United Nations Global Compact, WWF, and the World Resources Institute. And those 4 organizations together have set up the Science-Based Target Initiative. The initiative is all about developing standards for target setting, and they also validate those companies who want to commit publicly to a target that is aligned with science to actually check if their target is robust and ambitious enough. It does rely on the carbon accounting standards. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative hasn't written any new standards on how to account for carbon, but only on how to set proper targets. And so far, over 1,000, so actually 1,226 companies globally have committed to and published a validated science-based target. That means those businesses align with the Paris Agreement. Most of them now, initially you could set science-based targets that would limit your warming to 2 degrees. That has been tightened up and now is 1.5 or well below 2 degrees. The overall aim of the Science-Based Target Initiative is that we keep warming on this lovely planet to 1.5 degrees. And that means also that we need to halve our emissions by 2030. So those are sort of the core aims of the Science-Based Target Initiative. In simpler words, the science-based targets really remove the question of how much you can do or can comfortably do, and instead it says how much you need to do in order to achieve this 1.5 degrees. And the 1.5 degrees are really important, because if it was 2 degrees, we'd have 2.6 times the impact on people from extreme heat events. We'd have 10 times the number of ice-free summers in the Arctic. We'd have a significant change in sea level rise, and also biodiversity loss would be significantly more. There was just a couple of weeks ago, came out a report from the IPCC really urging us to the 1.5 again. Knowing the audience, you all don't need convincing, but you might need to convince others. So 1.5 really is what we want to aim for, what we need to aim for. And the Science-Based Target initiatives have set up the frameworks on how to actually set those targets. There are guidelines for different sectors, but there is also what they themselves call the one-size-fits-all approach, which is absolute contraction. These are the minimum annual linear reduction rates. And it's very simple. If you want to commit to 1.5, it's a 4.2 reduction of your carbon emissions every year. For well below 2 degrees, it's 2.5 annual reduction. And if we achieve that, we might actually keep that Tasman glacier that you can see on the photo alive. I have not traveled there, but I do want to talk about the photo for a moment. So a slight detour from science-based targets, if I may. The photo is not from one of the free databases like Unsplash, but it's from a New Zealand database of images called Axio. And what they do, they actually pay their photographers fairly for the images that they provide. They're not very costly to download. You have to pay a little bit, but that is just fair because the people sharing their photos actually make them available. So we try to find as many New Zealand images as we can. Back to net zero. That one is from Axio too. What does net zero really mean? Because there are so many different definitions of net zero around, and not all net zero pledges actually are created equal. Is net zero the same as carbon neutral? And what is in, what is out? How do I draw my boundaries? If I say, we'll be net zero, but it's only for our scope 1 and 2 emissions, or we'll be net zero, but only for some of our scope 3 emissions. So if organizations just set those audacious net zero goals, we'd have to actually dig in and understand what do they mean with net zero. And would they achieve their zero target by just offsetting, or do they actually reduce, and by when? And so there are all those questions that we'd actually need to understand if we want to see a company that has set a net zero goal actually means it's net zero aligned with science. And that is why the Science-Based Target Initiative have launched and have actually published a net zero standard to say what net zero really means, to just take that ambiguity out. And what net zero really means is to include the emissions of the company and the suppliers and the value chain in a net zero target. It also doesn't leave you any choice whether you want to do well below 2. It has to be 1.5 degrees for scope 1 and 2, well below 2 for scope 3. So the net zero standard sets that very clearly. It also encourages businesses to go further and do what you might have heard about in the TCFD, that is the climate-related risks. And those need to be considered as well. So it does lead to the conclusion that it's possibly a change in business model that you need in order to actually achieve your net zero standard, net zero target. So those are sort of 3 guiding principles. And I did reproduce one of the graphs of the net zero standard, which has it all included. And I'll dive into a little bit more detail and unpack that. But I just thought a graphic is just easier to explain it all. So we've got our 2050. That's when net zero has to be achieved. If you want to be properly net zero, a properly validated net zero target under the Science-Based Target Initiative, it needs to be by 2050 the latest. What you can see here, there is also a near-term target, and that is in the next 5 to 10 years, because we can't wait to the last minute to do it all. Firstly, we can't actually do that. And secondly, it's too late. We do need to reduce emissions significantly now. Those are the bars, the blue bars. That's a short-term target, a long-term target. And then you see down here the gray area. And the gray area is offsetting. And offsetting is okay alongside reduction. It's not a replacement of reduction. And that is beyond the company's value chain. If you want to do something good, get some really good credits, then that's perfectly fine, but it's alongside reduction. And the purple here comes in, and you can see that actually equals the remaining emissions in 2050. What you cannot reduce by 2050, that needs to be removed. And it's actually carbon removals to achieve that net zero. Now, going through that a bit more slowly, step by step, the goal remains the same as 1.5. That is the goal. And how far out are we looking? We are looking near term, 5 to 10 years, and long term, the target needs to be by 2050. So if an organization says we'll be net zero by 2070, that is not in line with science. And you also need to have stepping stones to get there. So you have to have an interim target, a near-term target within the next 5 to 10 years. Because when we go back to the beginning, the Science Based Targets initiative is all about also encouraging businesses to halve emissions by 2030. And that is why we need that near-term target. And it does mean about 90% emissions reduction by 2050 for most businesses. Otherwise, it's not going to be really net zero. If we just look back at this, this really here shows that 90% reduction by 2050. And it's not just an example, that is how much emissions actually have to go down. So how far are we looking, and how far do we actually go? So what does that higher ambition really mean? It means 1.5 for scope 1 and 2. There is no 2 degrees, there is no well below 2 degrees for scope 1 and 2, it's 1.5 for scope 1 and 2. And it is well below for scope 3. Now, the really big question is, what is included in scope 3? How much of our scope 3 do we have to include? Quite often you hear people talking about mandatory scope 3 emissions. There is no such thing as mandatory scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are the emissions that you indirectly cause by your actions. And they're all relevant. And that is why a long-term target must now cover over 95% of scope 3 emissions. And that is of all scope 3 emissions. So that is quite ambitious. And that is why there was that third point. You might have to also look at transition risks. And it might mean changing business models rather than just tweaking around the edges. And what about the old targets? What if a company has already set a science-based target? Like we have set a science-based target already for our organization. And so I have 13 other New Zealand businesses. So if they wanted to now say, okay, we want a net zero target, science aligned, then we would have to update that. So our target already is with in line with 1.5 degrees. Others were very early and might have got a 2 degree or well below 2 degree target, and they would have to actually update that to make it that more ambitious target. And also 100% offsetting is not an option to actually achieve net zero under that standard. It's only for the last 10% that you can turn to the forest for removals. So that is in essence what that net zero standard is all about. Now, what does it have to do with LCA? How does scope 3 relate to LCA? If we look at our typical life cycle from raw materials manufacturing, transport, more processing, someone buys the goods, bring them home, They use them, the waste might go somewhere else, gets recycled. We've got energy and other things coming in. We've got waste and other emissions coming out. That's what we are all familiar with as the good LCANZ community. But how does that relate to scope 3? They basically just move around a bit, align beautifully with the scope 3 categories, the 15 categories that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has defined. So we've got our purchased goods and services that are in our supply chain. Capital goods probably could be in the LCA, but definitely are in scope 3 if they're relevant. The energy, transport, upstream, then waste. For scope 3, we actually also have business travel. We also have employee commuting and leased assets. We wouldn't have those in LCA. So scope 3 actually goes a bit broader. And downstream in LCA, we cover the transport, we cover the processing, we cover the use of sold goods, we cover end of life. We don't cover leased assets, franchises, and investments in LCA. But what that image shows is there is a good deal of overlap. And if an organization has already done an LCA of their products, they have a really good understanding of what their scope 3 emissions are. And that is, I think, where that overlap is between our community today, the LCANZ community, and helping organizations to achieve their net zero target aligned with science by covering all of the scope 3 emissions. Greenhouse Gas Protocol ages ago published a table very similar to this, and that gives a bit of an indication on, depending in which industry you are, what your most relevant scope 3 emissions are. That doesn't include all the 15 categories, and it's really only a rough overview, but it gives some indication on where you might have to dig deepest. And that is also, and you can see there are boxes everywhere. It does mean there cannot be mandatory scope 3 emissions overall, but they're relevant and need to be discussed and determined for every single business, really, separately. The main thing, though, is get started. It really doesn't have to be perfect at the beginning, like now, but it does need to be perfect by 2030 and definitely by 2050. For now, it's really about getting started with setting and understanding science-based targets, and definitely the net zero targets aligned with science. And to really see that there is a difference between just the net zero pledge and an actually science-aligned, science-based aligned net zero target.
Yeah, really good walkthrough of what science-based targets are, and the link into LCA is really useful. I think you've explained really well how doing an LCA would help a company to then set a science-based target and understand what their scope 3 emissions are. But was curious, could you see a need for companies to set reduction targets, net zero targets for products?
Well, I think there would be. I think it'll be difficult to have a proper net zero product because there will always be emissions, but we'll just have to find possibly different feedstocks, different energy sources to do the manufacturing. So I think, yes, actually it could be done, and they would bring us a big way forward for the organizational net zero target. So yes, break it down to products.
Yeah, they go nicely hand in hand. Awesome. Well, there are some questions coming in, so I will jump over to some of those. I'll start with Sarvesh because he actually messaged right near the start and would like to know, according to you, what's the most important step right now to be taken by organizations and customers collectively for achieving net zero and also to maintain the critical limit under 1.5?
Measure where you are and come up with a serious reduction strategy. Depending on what type of business it is, If you were like a services type business and your main impact is in travel, consider if you actually need to travel, or if you just do fewer in-person long distance meetings and do them by electric car. That's one measure that we've taken. Or see what you can do now and bring on board your suppliers. You can't do it without your suppliers.
Yep, very true. Thank you. Shayasi would like an overview of what exactly the scopes are and what they mean. You might have gone too detailed too quickly.
Here we are. So scope 1, your direct emissions. You own a vehicle, you buy petrol, you burn that, that is your scope 1 emission. You own a building and has air conditioning in it, it needs topping up with refrigerants because there is losses. You own that, that's your scope 1 direct emissions. Scope 2, I've just put electricity usage in here. If you were actually buying steam or natural gas, then that could also be scope 2. Scope 3, everything else. So that is everything you buy. It would be the capital goods you have, it's your business travel, your waste, your employee commuting. If you don't own your office, but you lease office space, and you might have electricity included in the lease price, so you'd have to account for that. If you were manufacturing, say, fridges, the use of those fridges, or if you were selling heaters, the use of those heaters would be also your scope 3.
I think if you go back another few slides, Zara asked to explain what the removal of carbon is in the diagram and how it's different to reducing carbon.
So what is the difference between removal in the diagram and how is it different to reducing carbon? Removal is to actually physically remove carbon from the atmosphere, just taking it out. Trees can do that really well. There is mechanical ways of doing it too, but it's actually physically getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, turning it into carbon and storing it. Whereas reduction is just, I move to a more efficient car, I have less emissions. I drive less, I have less emissions. I might eat less red meat and therefore cause fewer emissions. I might not have fewer emissions.
Yeah, cool. And yeah, just to reconfirm what you already said, SBTi require that we reduce by 90% for most companies to get to net zero. So you cannot be net zero until you've actually done that reduction. Even if you're offsetting everything else, you have to do the reduction first.
It's a good measure to go along with because it helps along the way. So it doesn't say offsets aren't good. They are very useful, but they won't get you to net zero.
Caroline was asking, could you explain how science-based targets can be created for other LCA measurements, so for other indicators?
Well, the right group of people would need to get together. I think they could be done for, say, eutrophication. Ozone depletion, I think we've almost done that for, because we had the Montreal Protocol.
Yep, very successfully.
So there is a precedent that it can be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think eutrophication and nutrients out into waterways could be another one. Good use of and that would have so many positive side effects. It would be more effective food production. It would be more effective use of the fertilizer, which often comes from fossil sources as well. So that would also have a carbon impact. But yeah, I think that could be the case. Or it could be for resource use type indicators as well in LCA.
Yeah. And
there are a number of different ones, particulate emissions.
Yeah. I think linking into to Kate's webinar last week on planetary accounting, that's what the Planetary Accounting Network is trying to do. Yeah. There's also for those who are interested, there's also the Science Based Targets Network. It's aligned with Science Based Targets Initiative. They've started looking at targets for nature. So some of those other indicators and other areas. So they're still very much in consultation phase. So people who are interested, go and check them out, because I think the more input they have from LCA people, the better.
I think there are also initiatives like carbon trading. There will be trading of other things like nitrogen or phosphorus type credits, if you like, or caps on those. So I think they could be coming.
So Ray's asked if you'd recommend then to use a combined approach of LCA and ISO 14064 to fully encompass and include those other emissions shown with the white logos in your scope 3.
Yes. No, I think the combination really is what organizations should be doing, because you'd miss out on large chunks if you do just LCA or just corporate carbon. So
Sarah then has asked, for the construction industry, what were the main scopes in the table that SBTi, I think it was SBTi published, and the scope 3?
Was the greenhouse gas protocol a while ago.
Yeah, greenhouse gas protocol, yeah.
They haven't actually, that was in a presentation, and they shared that presentation afterwards. So I can't find it online anymore. So they haven't, unfortunately, put that up somewhere, but it was in one of the presentations of one of their staff that was shared afterwards.
For that.
So it's purchased goods. A lot of it's actually one of the categories where scope 1 and 2 are really significant. And then there is used of sold goods. That would be, for example, how energy efficient are the buildings?
Yeah.
Because running a building does use a lot of energy compared to building the building and all the building materials. So it's evening out a bit, because we need more materials bringing this side up to make the houses keep the warmth better, which brings this side down. So it's sort of, it's not quite reversing, but the material side and the use of sold goods will come closer to each other.
Okay, last question that I can see. So if anyone hasn't asked their question, you might have missed the boat. From Damon, he's part of a large organization with a big focus on sustainability and science-based targets as part of their emissions reduction commitments. How can he begin to introduce LCA thinking to operational and product design making? It seems like the benefits are not seen as worth the time or costs of conducting LCA. And what are some easy ways that organizations can begin to dip the toe into LCA thinking? I'm so glad somebody asked that question.
Well, you're in the right place. Talk to people in LCANZ and in the community. I think the best way to really get started is do exactly that. Start with life cycle thinking. Take a piece of paper and draw up the full supply chain. And then start thinking, where does all my stuff come from? How does it come here? How much of what do I need? And you'll start getting a sense for some of the potential hotspots. And if you then actually do run the data, those hotspots might shift. But it gives you an idea. And I think in one of the previous summits, we had someone giving a presentation they did their first LCA, and they said, when we started, we just wanted to do it because customers were asking. But we then used it to do our TCFD reporting. We used it to better do our modern slavery statements. And I mean, like, how did you bring those two together? And then, well, the LCA forced us to actually properly understand our full supply chain, right into the minute detail of not only where do the products come from that we buy, but where do the ingredients for those products come from. And that gave us a whole lot of transparency. And that, I think, is a good way to start.
Barbara, thank you so much. It's been really informative. And there's a thank you there from Damon for tackling his question. It wasn't that bad.
No, it was a good one. Thanks.
It was. It was, yeah, thank you very much. It's been wonderful. And this is not the end. We have some more webinars coming up. So do keep checking out our website where you can sign up and register for them if you haven't already. We've got some very cool stuff coming up this side of Easter around carbon with zero carbon steel, and also Firth talking about their embodied carbon calculator, so you can see things put into practice. And then after Easter and the school holidays, we'll reconvene for water and lots of work around water footprinting. So yeah, don't forget about our competition, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Emily.